Hello everyone, welcome to Frightful Whispers. I'm here to guide you into the shadows tonight. I know you're using this video to unwind and drift off to sleep. So, before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you watching from? And what time is it for you? Now, get cozy, relax, and let the whispers of the night take over. I had never wanted to return here, but some dark force, called me back. Mitchell House, our family's ancestral home, had been nothing but a nightmare to me, even when I was a child. The very sight of it was enough to send a cold shiver down my spine, though I hadn't stepped foot inside it in over 10 years. Yet, here I was, standing at its threshold, with no way to escape the pull that had brought me back. The house was a towering silhouette against the fading sky, its spires like skeletal fingers reaching for the heavens. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, a sickly mixture of rot that seemed to seep from the very walls. The yard, once manicured and alive with color, had long since fallen into neglect. Vines snaked up the pillars, claiming the stonework as their own. The wildness of nature had consumed the place, as though the earth was trying to reclaim what had been taken. My heart was hammering in my chest as I stood at the base of the crooked cobblestone path that led to the front door. The house seemed to stare at me, its windows like hollow eyes, dark and unblinking. I could feel its presence pressing in on me, suffocating me. It was waiting for me to return, to confront what had been buried in its depths. "Let's just get this over with," Jonathan's voice cut through my thoughts. I looked over at him, my older brother, Jonathan Mitchell. He didn't feel what I felt. His footsteps were steady, his demeanor resolute, as if this house, this place, were no more than a relic of the past. He didn't believe in ghosts or curses. To him, it was all history, family history, something to be documented, analyzed, and forgotten. But I knew better. I had known this house long before he had, and I knew that it wasn't just the memories that haunted it. There was something darker, something ancient, something I couldn't outrun. I swallowed hard, taking the first step onto the path. The crunch of gravel beneath my boots felt like thunder in the oppressive silence, as if the house was listening. The fog was rolling in, thick and soupy, and it clung to the edges of the yard, wrapping around the foundation of the house like a suffocating cloak. The wind whispered through the trees, sending their skeletal branches twisting in unnatural patterns. They looked like hands reaching for me, trying to drag me back into the darkness. I could feel it. The weight of the house pressing down on me, waiting. Jonathan was already at the door, impatient, tugging at the handle as if he were opening any other door. It creaked as it slowly swung inward, revealing the dark void of the house's interior. "It's just a house, Sarah," Jonathan called back, his voice dismissive as he stepped inside. "We have work to do." "Work? What kind of work?" I followed him, every instinct screaming at me to turn around, to leave, to run as far and fast as I could. But I couldn't. It was too late for that. I had come to face the past, and whether I was ready or not, the past was about to drag me back in. The moment I stepped inside, the air felt different. Heavier, colder. It wasn't just the chill of the weather outside. It was something else. Something that had waited for me. I could feel it crawling beneath my skin, like invisible fingers running up my spine. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, the house settling with an eerie familiarity. Every room I passed seemed to whisper, their walls holding secrets that had been buried for decades. This wasn't just a house. It was a tomb of memories, a tomb of secrets. I turned my eyes upward, my heart skipping a beat. The second-floor windows, those dark, unblinking eyes, were staring back at me. But there was something different this time. They seemed to watch me, not just as a presence in the distance, but as a knowing thing. The figure was there again, standing in the window. A figure I knew too well, yet could never fully grasp. My pulse quickened, and I took a step back, my feet suddenly unsure of the ground beneath them. "Jonathan, do you see that?" He didn't even look up, his eyes fixed on the stack of family records scattered across a wooden desk in the study. "It's nothing, Sarah. You're imagining things again." But I wasn't imagining it. I had seen it every night since I arrived, his figure. The figure of a man, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me. The man had been watching me, watching us. That man, he was my great-grandfather. "Jonathan, I swear to you, he's there again," I said, my voice trembling. "Look at the window." Jonathan finally turned to face me, his expression unreadable. He looked up, scanning the window, then shook his head in irritation. "There's nothing there, Sarah. I don't know what you think you saw, but it's just a trick of the light." I opened my mouth to protest, but my voice faltered as the temperature in the room seemed to drop suddenly, the hairs on my neck standing up straight. The house was alive again. It wasn't just the air. It was the house itself, drawing me in, suffocating me with its history. Something was wrong. I couldn't take my eyes off the window. It was as if the house itself were laughing, mocking me. And then, through the corner of my eye, I saw it. Movement. The figure was still there, but now it was closer, pressing against the glass. His face, pale, gaunt, and contorted in rage, was inches from the window. His hollow eyes burned with an intensity I couldn't comprehend. He was no longer just watching me, he was waiting for me. And in that moment the silence of the house shattered. The wind howled through the broken windows, rattling the glass. A voice, a whisper, barely audible but unmistakable, echoed through the halls. "You are mine." I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The room spun around me, the walls closing in. Jonathan had turned back to his work, oblivious, but I couldn't focus on him anymore. I had to know who this man was, what he wanted. I had to know why he was here. But as I took a step forward, I felt it. The weight of 1,000 eyes pressing down on me, as if the house itself were watching, waiting for me to uncover the truth. And I knew with a cold certainty that the truth would come at a cost. The cost would be more than I could ever pay. I never wanted to come back here, not after everything that happened, but the pull was undeniable. Mitchell House, my family's ancestral home, loomed over me like a living, breathing thing. A place that had once been a sanctuary and later became my prison. I hadn't stepped foot inside this place in over 10 years, and yet here I was, standing at its decaying threshold. My stomach churned, my skin prickled with that familiar sense of dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching me, waiting. The air was thick and heavy with the scent of mildew and age. The once proud cobblestone path leading to the front door was cracked and overgrown with weeds, nature slowly reclaiming the land. But it was the house itself that struck me the hardest. The windows, dark and empty, seemed to stare down at me with an almost knowing malice. The once grand pillars on the porch sagged beneath the weight of time, and the shutters hung loosely from their hinges. It felt like the house was trying to hold its breath, like it was waiting for something, or someone. I couldn't understand why I had returned. The trauma from my childhood, the pain of losing my mother here, had kept me away for so long. But now, there I was, holding the key to the house in my trembling hand, the key to a bloodline that had been marred by something dark. "Let's just get this over with." Jonathan's voice broke through my thoughts, snapping me out of the trance the house had placed on me. I glanced at my older brother, Jonathan Mitchell, already walking toward the door with his typical air of indifference. He wasn't bothered by this place. To him, it was just another historical relic, a family monument to be documented and analyzed. He was the local historian, after all. Ghosts and curses were nothing more than fodder for idle talk to him. But I knew better. I felt the weight of the house. I had always felt it. Jonathan pushed the door open with a creak, revealing the dark, oppressive interior. The house groaned as if it had been waiting for us to step inside, and for a moment I thought I might turn and run. The memories hit me like a tidal wave. Flashes of cold nights spent huddled in my room, strange noises in the halls, the way the shadows moved when no one was looking. But I couldn't escape it. Not now. I followed Jonathan inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was musty and thick with dust. The floorboards creaked with every step, as though the house itself was groaning in protest. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional rasp of wind slipping through the cracks in the walls. Jonathan didn't seem to notice. He was already headed to the study, where the family records were kept, diving into the past as though it were just another chapter in a history book. He didn't see it. He couldn't feel it. The house wasn't just filled with history. It was alive with it. And the ghosts of that history lingered in every dark corner. I found myself drawn to the staircase, my feet moving on their own accord as if guided by some invisible force. I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I had to face it. There was a window on the second floor, a place where I had seen him. The figure. Every night since I had arrived, he had appeared, standing motionless in the window, watching, waiting. A shadow that never moved, yet always seemed to follow me. My legs felt like lead as I climbed the stairs, each creak of the steps echoing in the silence. The air grew colder the higher I went, and the house seemed to stretch around me, its old bones groaning in protest. I could feel the eyes of the house on me, its walls pressing in, tightening, as though they were trying to suffocate me. When I reached the second floor, I didn't need to look around. My eyes were already drawn to the window. I could feel his presence there, just as I had every night. I stepped forward, my breath catching in my throat. And then I saw him. There he was, the figure. Standing in the window, just as I had seen him before. His shape was faint at first, just a dark silhouette against the faint light from outside. But as I stepped closer, the figure began to take form. His face was gaunt, too pale, stretched thin over sharp bones. His eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, stared at me with a kind of silent accusation. His lips parted, but no sound came from them. He was speaking to me, his mouth moving in silent words that I couldn't hear but felt. "You're next." The words echoed in my mind, cold and hollow. I stumbled back, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. I wanted to scream, but the air felt thick, suffocating. The house seemed to draw the sound from my lungs, trapping me in a silence I couldn't escape. The figure didn't move, but somehow I knew he was watching me, waiting for me to acknowledge him. His eyes were cold, his expression one of deep, endless bitterness. The same bitterness that had seeped into every corner of this house, into my bloodline. I couldn't tear my eyes away. I couldn't. "Sarah?" Jonathan's voice broke through the suffocating silence, but it sounded so far away. "What are you doing up here?" I turned slowly, my mind still caught in the grip of the figure's gaze. Jonathan was standing at the bottom of the stairs looking up at me with confusion. His eyes scanned the hallway, but he didn't seem to notice what I had seen. "Sarah?" he repeated, his voice laced with annoyance. What the hell is going on? I opened my mouth to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. My legs shook beneath me as I turned back toward the window, but the figure was gone. Just like that, vanished. The window stared back at me, empty and cold. "There's someone standing in the window," I said, my voice barely a whisper, the words feeling wrong, as though I didn't fully believe them myself. Jonathan's gaze flickered to the window, then back at me. "You're imagining things. There's nothing there." But I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had felt. "I'm not imagining it," I said, my voice trembling. "He was there. He's here." Jonathan shook his head, his expression hardening. "This is ridiculous, Sarah. You've been through a lot. You need to rest." He turned and walked back toward the stairs, muttering something under his breath about needing to focus on the family records. But I couldn't move. I couldn't leave this place. Not yet. I knew what I had seen. The man in the window wasn't just some trick of the light. He wasn't a ghost or a figment of my imagination. He was my great-grandfather, the one who had died in this house, and he was waiting for me, waiting to claim what was his. And somehow I knew that this was only the beginning. I never wanted to return here, but something deep inside me called me back. Mitchell House, the place where I had once found refuge and later lost everything, was now standing before me again, its decaying presence drawing me in like a magnet. The house had always been a place of dread in my memory, but now, as I stood at its threshold once more, it felt different. It was no longer just a building. It was alive, pulsing with something dark, something waiting. The air around me was thick with the scent of mildew and age, the familiar staleness of a place long forgotten. The cobblestone path leading to the door was cracked, overtaken by weeds and the creeping vines that seemed to claim the land as their own. Mitchell House loomed ahead, its tall windows like dark eyes watching me, waiting. The grand columns on the porch sagged, and the shutters hung loosely, as though the house itself had grown weary, its bones bending under the weight of time. My heart thudded in my chest, a primal sense of unease creeping up my spine. I could feel the house, feel it pressing in on me, wrapping around me like a shroud. It knew I was here, and it had been waiting. I looked at Jonathan, standing beside me with his arms crossed. My older brother. He was different from me, detached, logical, driven by history and facts. Mitchell House was nothing more than an interesting subject for him to research. Ghosts? Curses? They didn't exist in Jonathan's world. To me, this house was a tomb. A place that had swallowed up my childhood and never let it go. Jonathan turned to me, breaking my reverie. "Come on, Sarah, let's just get this over with," he said with a sharp tone. The words were dismissive, but I knew they were meant to push me forward, to rid me of whatever irrational fear gripped me. But it wasn't fear, it was something else. A deep, gnawing sense of dread that had settled in my gut the moment I set foot on the property. I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't pretend it wasn't real. The door creaked open before we even touched the handle. I froze. The wind hadn't stirred. There was no draft to explain it. The house had welcomed us in, and with that creak, I felt the weight of its secrets pressing against me. Jonathan shrugged and walked inside, muttering something about getting to work. But I stood there for a moment longer, staring at the house that had been both my prison and my past. Something was wrong. Something was watching me. I could feel it. Taking a deep breath, I followed Jonathan inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air thickened around me. The house was silent. Too silent. And yet, it hummed, like the space between the walls was alive with something just out of reach. The walls, the floors, Even the ceiling seemed to sag under the weight of a presence that had never left. Jonathan had already moved on to the study, his back turned to me as he began to sift through the old family records. He didn't feel it. He couldn't. But I did. I had always felt it. The house had eyes, and those eyes had been watching me, waiting for my return. I walked down the hallway, every step echoing too loudly in the silence. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Something only I could set in motion. And then I saw it. The window. It had always been the same. The second-floor window, just at the end of the hall. The same place I had seen him the first time. The man in the window. But now, as I approached, the air around me grew colder, sharper, and I could feel my pulse quicken. The figure, his shape, was there again, just as I had feared. Standing motionless in the window, his face a dark silhouette against the glass. His features were hard to make out at first, but his presence was undeniable. He was there, watching me. I stood frozen in place, my breath shallow. I didn't want to look closer, I didn't want to see his face, didn't want to feel that cold grip of fear that always followed him. But I couldn't stop myself. My feet moved forward, as though guided by something beyond my control. As I neared the window, the figure became clearer. He was an old man, his face gaunt and hollow, his skin stretched thin over sharp bones. His eyes, empty, dark pits, stared at me with such intensity that it felt like his gaze was burning into my soul. There was no warmth in those eyes, no sign of life, only cold, endless watching. My heart slammed against my ribs as I stepped back, the terror rising like bile in my throat. The figure didn't move. He just stood there, unmoving, staring at me with that empty, accusing gaze. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I just knew that he was waiting for something, waiting for me. "Jonathan!" I gasped, but my voice was barely a whisper, lost in the vast emptiness of the house. "Do you see this? Do you see him?" But Jonathan didn't turn around. His back was still to me, absorbed in the records. He couldn't see him. I was alone in this. Alone with the ghost of my great-grandfather. The man who had died in this very house. The man who had been murdered. The house groaned around me, the walls bending, creaking under the weight of a history I couldn't escape. I took another step backward, my body shaking. And then the figure moved, slowly, deliberately, as though every movement took an eternity. His hand, clawed and pale, pressed against the window, the sound of glass scraping against bone filling the room. I froze. And then, with a voice as cold and ancient as the house itself, he spoke. His words were barely a whisper, but they seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. "You know me," the voice rasped. "You have always known me." My blood ran cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The words echoed in my mind, like a door opening to a past I had tried so hard to bury. This man, this ghost. He wasn't just some random specter. He was my great-grandfather, Thomas Mitchell. "You are my bloodline," he continued, his face twisting in an expression that mixed grief with rage. "You are the one who must pay for the sins of your family." "Pay?" I choked out. "What sins? What do you want from me?" Thomas's eyes burned with an intensity that pierced me to my core. "The betrayal, the murder. I was murdered. And you, my descendant, are the one who must end it. You must pay for what was taken." The house seemed to close in around me, its walls pressing against me, suffocating me. The cold intensified, and I could feel the darkness wrapping around my soul. I stepped forward, compelled, my hand reaching for the window. But as I did, I felt it. The coldest presence I had ever known crawling over my skin, freezing my very soul. I knew what he wanted now. He didn't want peace. He didn't want release. He wanted revenge. And he was going to get it. He was going to make sure the Mitchell bloodline paid for the sins of its past. The glass shattered. The room shook. And the figure in the window, my great-grandfather, looked at me with eyes that knew what I would become. The curse had been awakened, and I was the next to fall. I never wanted to come back to Mitchell House, but something kept pulling me here, an unexplainable force, as if the very walls were calling my name. The house, with all its dark secrets, had always been a place of nightmares to me. It was where my childhood ended, where everything I loved was torn away. And now, here I was, standing in its shadow once more, the weight of its history pressing against me, suffocating me. The house was exactly how I remembered it, tall, decaying, and somehow waiting. Its tall windows were like eyes, staring down at me as if they knew everything I had tried to forget. The door creaked open without a touch, as though it had been expecting me. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest, and immediately the air around me thickened. The silence was almost unbearable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching me. The walls felt like they were alive, pressing in on me with every step. Jonathan, my older brother, didn't share my unease. He was always the logical one, the historian. He had no patience for the supernatural, no time for the ghosts of our past. He was focused on the family records, trying to piece together the history of the Mitchells like some forgotten artifact. He didn't know what this house really was, what it really contained. But I knew. I had always known. The first night, as I lay in my childhood room, the same room I had been in when everything fell apart, I felt it. The air was different here, charged with something unnatural. And then there was the figure in the window. Every night I would catch a glimpse of him, a dark, motionless silhouette standing behind the glass. He never moved, he never blinked. He just stared at me, his eyes hollow and empty, like they were waiting for something. The figure was my great-grandfather, Thomas Mitchell. The first time I saw him, I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew. I knew that what I was seeing was real. I went to Jonathan that night, desperate for answers, but he dismissed me, as he always did. "It's just an old house, Sarah," he said. "You're imagining things." He didn't understand. He didn't feel it like I did. He couldn't see the shadows that moved in the corners, the whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. But I could. I needed to know more. So I did what I should have done from the start. I started reading the family records Jonathan had so diligently compiled. The deeper I dug, the more I realized how little we knew about the Mitchells. The family's history was steeped in darkness, but the deeper truth had been buried, obscured by years of silence and shame. As I read, the truth began to surface, like an old wound that had never healed. My great-grandfather, Thomas Mitchell, had been murdered by his own brother, Frank Mitchell. But the story wasn't as simple as betrayal. No, it was far darker. Frank hadn't killed Thomas out of greed or hatred. He had done it to protect the family. Protect the family from what? That's when I came across the chilling revelation buried deep in the records. It wasn't just greed or jealousy that tore the Mitchells apart. It was a curse. The Mitchells weren't just ordinary people. They were bound to the land, bound to this house, by a dark pact, a pact forged in blood and sealed by betrayal. Thomas Mitchell had discovered the truth. He had uncovered the dark secret that lay at the heart of the Mitchell legacy. But what he found was so horrifying, so beyond comprehension, that it drove him to try to escape, try to break the curse that had tainted their bloodline for generations. Frank, desperate to protect the family and keep the dark force contained, had taken Thomas's life to prevent him from destroying everything. But even Frank couldn't escape the curse. No one could. The darkness had already taken root, and no one was safe. Not even the bloodline that had started it. The more I read, the more I realized that this wasn't just a story. This was my legacy, my bloodline. And now, the curse had come for me. I dropped the journal, my hands shaking as I tried to comprehend what I had just learned. I wasn't just here to face ghosts. I was here to face the sins of my ancestors. Sins that had bound me to this place, this family, this fate. And as I sat there, the weight of it all crashing down on me, I felt it. The house groaned. The air grew cold, icy cold, and I could hear it, the whisper. The voice that I had been hearing for days now, growing louder and clearer with every passing hour. You are the one. I stood up, heart pounding in my chest, and turned toward the door. I wasn't alone. I could feel it. I didn't want to turn around, didn't want to face the truth of what I was about to see. But I had no choice. The air around me seemed to shift. And then I saw him. Thomas Mitchell. He stood in the doorway, his gaunt face framed by the dim light of the hallway. His eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, stared at me, and for a moment I felt as if they were looking right through me, as though they knew everything I had tried to bury. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. His presence, his energy filled the room. And in that moment I understood that everything that had happened, everything I had been running from, had led to this very moment. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The figure in front of me was more than just a ghost. He was the curse. He was the embodiment of everything that had gone wrong in this house, in this family. You know me, he whispered, his voice rough and cold. His words pierced through me like an icy dagger. You are my descendant, he continued, his voice growing stronger, more insistent, and you will pay for what has been done. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The truth hit me like a tidal wave. The betrayal, the murder, the darkness that had taken root in my bloodline. It was all coming for me now. It had always been coming, and there was no escaping it. Thomas stepped forward, his form flickering in the dim light, his cold presence washing over me. You are the last, he rasped. You are the last Mitchell, and now you will pay the price. And in that moment I realized there was no escape. I had thought I could outrun my past. I had thought I could bury it. But the truth was unavoidable. The house was alive with it. The curse had found me, and now I had no choice but to face it. The Mitchell bloodline had been cursed long before I was born, and now it was my turn to pay the price. I had never wanted to come back to Mitchell House, but somehow here I was. The house had always been a place of torment, a place where my childhood had ended and my life had unraveled. I could still hear my mother's cries, see the flickers of shadow in the corners of my mind that had never fully gone away. But I had to return. I had no choice. The pull was too strong, the weight of the past too heavy to ignore. The house was exactly how I remembered it. Tall, looming, decaying with age. Its windows, those dark, soulless eyes, seemed to watch me as I approached, like sentinels waiting for me to step into the shadows that awaited inside. The door creaked open without me touching it, an eerie welcome that sent a chill crawling up my spine. I stepped over the threshold, and immediately the air felt colder. The silence inside was suffocating, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to make my move. Jonathan had already gone to the study, his back turned to me as he sorted through the old family records. He was oblivious to everything. He didn't believe in ghosts. He thought this house was just a relic, a monument to a forgotten past. To him, the idea that something haunted these walls was just fantasy. But I knew better. I always had. The first night was the worst. I had barely closed my eyes before I saw it. Just a shadow at first, a flicker in the window across from me. But it didn't go away. It stood there, unmoving, watching. A man. An old man with a gaunt face and hollow eyes. His figure was nothing but a dark silhouette against the dim moonlight. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, that my mind was playing games with me. But deep down, I knew. He was real. Every night after that, he appeared again. Always in the same spot. Always staring at me with that same unblinking gaze. I couldn't escape it. I could feel his presence pressing in on me, suffocating me with his silence. I tried to tell Jonathan, but he dismissed it as nonsense, as if the house were nothing more than a collection of old bricks and wood. He didn't see what I saw. He couldn't. Then came the night when I finally faced it. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't pretend that the figure in the window was a figment of my imagination. So, I went to him. I climbed the stairs, each step creaking under my weight, the house groaning in protest. The higher I went, the colder it became. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thicker, as if the house itself was drawing me in, pulling me closer to whatever it was that waited at the top of those stairs. When I reached the second-floor landing, the air was frozen. I stood there, frozen, staring at the window across the hallway. And there he was, the figure. He hadn't moved. His eyes, those deep, hollow pits, stared back at me with a cold, knowing gaze. I took a step forward, my heart hammering in my chest. My breath came out in shallow gasps, the cold biting at my skin as I approached the window. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I touched the cold glass. And then he moved. The figure's hand pressed against the window, his face coming closer, his eyes burning into mine with such intensity that I felt like I was being consumed by them. His mouth opened, and I heard it, the voice, low, rasping, as though it came from the depths of the earth. "You know me." I froze, my heart lurching in my chest. It couldn't be. It couldn't be him, but I knew without a doubt. "You are my blood," the voice continued. "You are my descendant." Thomas Mitchell. It was him. My great-grandfather. The man whose death had shattered my family. The man whose ghost had been haunting me for days. The man whose presence had never left this house. "You must release me," he whispered, his voice hollow and desperate. "You must release my soul from this prison." I stumbled back, my mind racing. Release him? What did that mean? How could I possibly free his spirit when I was bound to the same curse that had claimed him? I knew then that the only way to escape this nightmare, to escape him, was to face it, to confront the past head-on. The curse had always been here, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to claim its next victim. And now, that victim was me. I had no choice. The ritual was the only way. I had read the old texts in the family records, ancient, cryptic, and filled with warnings that seemed too vague, too impossible to understand. But one thing was clear: there was a ritual, a way to free Thomas's spirit and hopefully break the curse that had bound my family to this house. I couldn't do it alone. Jonathan wouldn't believe me, wouldn't help me. He thought it was all in my head, but I knew better. The ritual had to be done at midnight, when the veil between the living and the dead was thinnest. I had gathered everything I needed: candles, incense, the family altar hidden deep within the house. The symbols on the altar seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, almost as if they were alive. I began the chant, the words spilling from my lips despite the fear gnawing at my insides. The candles flickered violently as the temperature in the room dropped. I could feel it, the presence. It was growing stronger, pressing against me like an invisible weight. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows reaching toward me, the air thickening with the force of the curse. I could hear it now, scraping, dragging sounds, like something was moving in the darkness, coming closer. I tried to keep my focus, tried to keep the chant steady, but the fear was rising in me, clawing at my chest. And then he appeared. Thomas. He was standing in front of me, his gaunt face twisted in a mixture of sorrow and rage. His eyes were hollow, empty, staring into mine as though they could see right through me. The very air around him crackled with energy, thick and electric. His voice filled my mind, deep and powerful, demanding, "You cannot release me," he rasped. "You are mine. The bloodline is mine. You will never escape it." I stumbled back, my legs shaking, but I couldn't look away. The room seemed to spin around me, the power of the curse overwhelming me, suffocating me. I had come this far. I couldn't stop now. I had to finish the ritual. "Release me," Thomas demanded again, his voice rising, filling the room with an unbearable weight. I felt the coldest chill run through me, the walls closing in. The final words of the chant left my lips, but as I spoke, a sharp pain shot through my chest, searing, burning, as though something was tearing me apart from the inside. The candles flared black, the room going completely dark. The house shook, and I could hear Thomas's laughter echoing in the darkness. "You cannot escape me," his voice whispered, his grip tightening around me like chains. "You will never escape me." And in that moment I knew. I had sealed my fate. There was no escaping the curse of the Mitchell bloodline. The darkness had taken me. I was now part of it, forever. I never wanted to return to Mitchell House. But there I was, standing before it again, the weight of its dark history pressing on me with a suffocating force. The house, with all its twisted secrets, had never truly left me. The nightmares, the feeling of being watched, of being haunted, had never stopped, even after I left. And now it was here, in front of me again, demanding that I face the horrors buried within its walls. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. An unsettling stillness, a silence too thick, too oppressive to ignore. The air was so cold it bit at my skin, but the chill wasn't just from the drafts or the broken windows. It was something else. The house had a pulse. It had a breath. And it was waiting for me. I tried to ignore the shiver that ran down my spine, but I couldn't. I was here. The house had pulled me back, just as it had always known it would. My brother, Jonathan, didn't understand. He dismissed it all. Ghosts, curses, and all the whispers of this old house. To him, it was just history. His focus was on research, the Mitchell family's past, something to be recorded and filed away. But I knew better. I knew that the house, that thing inside it, wasn't just a remnant of the past. It was alive. It was waiting for something, for someone to return. And now, that someone was me. That first night I saw him, the figure in the window. I tried to convince myself it was just the reflection of a branch, the play of light on an old, cracked pane. But as I stared at the figure, something cold coiled inside my chest. The face, the eyes, it was him, the ghost of Thomas Mitchell, my great-grandfather, who had died here long ago. I knew it in the deepest part of my soul. Every night after that, the figure would return. Always the same. His face gaunt and pale, his eyes hollow, empty. staring at me through the glass, unblinking, unyielding. He wasn't just haunting the house. He was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening, what was really happening in this place. But when I tried to speak to Jonathan, to tell him what I had seen, he brushed me off. He thought it was just a trick of my mind, a manifestation of grief, of trauma, of the things I had buried when I left. But the more I thought about it, the more I knew it wasn't just in my head. This house was alive with the past, and the past had found its way back to claim me. It wasn't until I found the journal that the truth began to make sense. The history of the Mitchells was a tangled web of betrayal, blood, and curses. But the deeper I went, the darker it became. The family didn't just build this house, they were bound to it. It was part of them. And my great-grandfather, Thomas, had uncovered the truth, the horrible truth. Thomas had discovered something so dark, so unspeakable, that he had tried to escape it. He had tried to break free from the curse that had gripped the Mitchell bloodline for generations. But it was too late. He had been murdered by his own brother, Frank. It wasn't a simple case of greed or jealousy. Frank hadn't killed Thomas for power. He had done it to protect the family, to protect them from what lay within this house. But the curse, whatever it was too powerful. It was older than the family, older than the house itself, and even Frank, in his attempt to stop it, couldn't escape its grip. I couldn't stop reading, couldn't stop searching for the answers, the details, the key that would unlock this nightmare. The more I read, the more I understood the truth. I was trapped. My family, my bloodline, they were all trapped. The curse had been passed down through the generations, and now it had found me. I was the last Mitchell, the last one to carry the weight of whatever terrible pact had been made long ago. I thought I could fix it. I thought I could end it all with a ritual. The texts were there, the incantations, the way to free Thomas's spirit and release the house from its curse. But I didn't understand what I was truly dealing with. I was trying to break something that had always been part of me, part of my family. It had woven itself into our very souls. There was no breaking free. The night of the ritual, everything went wrong. I had prepared everything. The altar, the candles, the incense, the ancient words of the chant that had been passed down through generations. At midnight, I would set everything right. At midnight, I would release Thomas's spirit, free myself from this house, and break the curse. I thought I had it all figured out. But the moment I started the chant, the air in the room changed. It pressed against me. The shadows grew darker, stretching toward me like hungry hands. The cold was suffocating. The voice came first, low, guttural, and unmistakably his. "You cannot release me." Thomas's voice echoed in my mind, sharp and invasive. "I am bound to this place, and you are bound to me." I stumbled backward, trying to continue the chant, but the words had no power anymore. The house, the spirits, the curse, it was all too strong. I could feel the walls closing in around me, the weight of centuries of darkness pressing against my chest. "You are mine," Thomas whispered. His voice was no longer just a whisper. It was a roar inside my mind, shaking me to my core. "And you will never escape me." The ritual had failed. I had summoned him. And now there was no going back. The room began to spin. The shadows became real, alive, reaching for me with cold, skeletal fingers. The walls, the floor, the very air, everything began to twist, to warp, as if the house itself was coming alive, its pulse quickening with every heartbeat, every breath I took. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I could only feel the curse wrapping itself around me, dragging me deeper into the darkness. I tried to scream, but the air was too thick. The weight of the curse was too heavy. I fell to my knees, my vision swimming, the darkness swallowing me whole. Then I saw him, Thomas, standing in front of me, no longer a mere figure in the window. He was real, standing tall and gaunt, his hollow eyes staring down at me with a mixture of sorrow and triumph. "You are the last," he whispered, his voice a chilling rasp. "The Mitchell bloodline ends with you." The truth hit me like a physical blow, and I understood then. The curse would never end. Not for me, not for any of us. I was the final Mitchell, the last to carry the name, the last to be bound to this house. The cycle would repeat over and over again, and I would be its prisoner forever. And there was no escape. The darkness took me then, just as it had taken everyone before me. The walls closed in, and I was swallowed whole by the house, by the curse, by the darkness that had claimed us all. I was no longer just a victim, I was a part of it, and I would never escape. Thank you for venturing into the shadows with me here at Frightful Whispers. Remember, the darkness holds secrets, but also whispers truths to those who dare to listen. If tonight's tale sent shivers down your spine, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. It helps keep the fire of fright alive. Rest easy, but keep one eye open, for the night is never truly still. Until we meet again, stay vigilant, stay curious, and let the whispers guide you.